Miss Marple and the Sealed Picnic Basket Mystery. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. Isn't it wonderful how these timeless mysteries bring us together no matter where we are? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, do you enjoy going out for a picnic when the weather is beautiful? Don't forget to subscribe, as over 80% of our listeners aren't subscribed yet, and we share new cozy mysteries every single day. Now settle into your blanket, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let's begin tonight's mystery. The village green of St. Mary Mead wore its finest dress on this particular Sunday afternoon in high summer. Bunting fluttered from the ancient oak trees, and white marquee tents dotted the emerald grass like elegant mushrooms after rain. The annual charity fete was in full swing, and the air hummed with the pleasant chatter of village life at its most convivial. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of the parish tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, as she observed the familiar dance of village society. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as winter frost, despite her advanced years, missed nothing of the small dramas unfolding around her. She had been tasked with folding the bid cards for the afternoon's main attraction, the secret hamper auction, a novel idea that had captured the imagination of St. Mary Mead's charitable souls. "Jane, dear, do you think the bows look quite right?" Lady Dolly Bantry approached with the measured steps of one accustomed to organizing village events. She was resplendent in a flowered dress that had seen better decades, but was pressed to perfection, her gray hair pinned beneath a hat that had once been fashionable. Miss Marple looked up from her bid cards to examine the row of wicker hampers arranged on the long trestle table. Each basket was adorned with an identical blue silk bow, tied with mathematical precision, and crowned with an embossed paper rosette that caught the afternoon sunlight. "They're quite beautiful, Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had observed human nature for 8 decades. "Your bows are always so distinctive. Right-hand double loop, and those bias cut-tails are your signature touch." Lady Bantry beamed with pleasure. "You do notice everything, Jane. I've tied everyone myself this morning. The committee thought it essential that each hamper look identical for the blind auction. After all, the excitement lies in not knowing what treasures lie within." The concept was charmingly simple. Local families had contributed picnic baskets filled with homemade delicacies, small gifts, and surprises. Each had been sealed with a gummed paper strip and adorned with a ceremonial bow and rosette before being numbered and offered for anonymous bidding. The highest bidders would claim their mystery hampers without knowing their contents, until the official unsealing at 4 UO. "Miss Laura has done excellent work with the seals," Lady Bantry continued, gesturing toward the stationer, who was bustling about with a fussy importance. "Each rosette is embossed with her own die, and those gummed strips ensure absolute integrity." Mavis Laura approached their table, her arms laden with spare rosettes and a small wooden box containing her sealing materials. She was a thin, nervous woman of middle years with prematurely gray hair and the slightly anxious expression of one who handled other people's money in her capacity as committee treasurer. "Lady Bantry, I do hope the seals meet with your approval," Miss Laura said, her voice carrying the precise tones of one accustomed to commercial transactions. "Each rosette bears the Laura and STMM watermark when held to the light, and I've used only the finest gum Arabic paste for the strips." Miss Marple accepted a spare rosette to examine, noting the crisp embossing and the way the paper crackled between her fingers. "Quite professional. Miss Laura, I imagine your stationery expertise proves invaluable for such precise work." A commotion near the hamper table drew their attention. A tall, sharp-featured man in a linen suit was examining the baskets with a critical eye of one accustomed to finding fault. His voice carried the clipped authority of metropolitan superiority. "Cyrus Bellamy," Lady Bantry murmured to Miss Marple, food columnist from London. He's here to write about our quaint country customs for his paper. I do hope he'll be kind. Mr. Bellamy lifted one of the larger hampers experimentally, his eyebrows rising at its weight. This one's substantial, he announced to no one in particular. Number 14, I see. What delightful rustic mysteries might it contain? Tom Quill, the village basket maker, stood nearby, polishing the handles of his handiwork with evident pride. He was a man of perhaps 60, weathered by years of working with willow and cane, his large hands surprisingly delicate when handling his craft. That's one of my willow and cane picnic models, sir, Tom said with quiet satisfaction. Built to last a lifetime with proper brass fittings and a hinge bar system that's been tried and tested for generations. Bellamy examined the basket's construction with the eye of a professional critic. Interesting craftsmanship. I assume these seals prevent any premature investigation of contents. Absolutely, Miss Laura interjected quickly. The gummed strip covers the lid joint completely, and the rosette provides additional security. Once sealed, the contents remain inviolate until the official unsealing. Counselor Ned Ashcroft appeared at Bellamy's elbow, his politician smile at full wattage. He was a man of ambitious mediocrity, forever seeking opportunities to advance his standing in county society. Mr. Bellamy, I do hope you'll mention our innovative approach to charitable fundraising in your column, Ashcroft said with practiced bonhomie. St. Mary Mead prides itself on combining tradition with creative thinking. Bellamy's smile held a sardonic edge. Oh, I shall certainly write about this afternoon's events, Counselor. My readers are always fascinated by provincial innovations. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she observed the subtle interplay of expressions around the hamper table. Inspector Slack stood near the tea tent in mufti, his day off marked by an ill-fitting sports jacket and an expression of suspicious boredom. Dr. Haddock circulated among the crowd, his medical bag abandoned in favor of a plate of cucumber sandwiches. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife moved through the gathering, with the practiced ease of those accustomed to parish social obligations. The auction itself proved surprisingly spirited. Miss Marple watched with interest as bidding cards fluttered like butterflies in the summer air. Hamper after hamper found eager purchasers, the mystery of their contents driving prices higher than practical logic might have warranted. When hamper 14 came up for bidding, Bellamy's card shot up decisively. 50, he called out, his voice cutting through the genteel murmur of competing bids. Lady Bantry's gavel fell with finality. Sold to Mr. Bellamy for $50. James will help you load it into your motor car. As the elderly butler struggled with the hamper's considerable weight, Bellamy laughed with genuine amusement. I shall make a column out of this, quite literally. Nothing like the mystery of unknown delicacies to whet the appetite. He paused it, his motor car calling back to Miss Laura, who was tidying her ceiling materials. The judging begins at 4 you said. I mustn't unseal before my photograph. Naturally, professional integrity demands proper documentation of their veal. Miss Laura smiled and nodded enthusiastically. 4 sharp, Mr. Bellamy. Do enjoy your solitary picnic. As Bellamy's motor car disappeared down the lane toward Ferryman's Lock, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to hamper 14's abandoned spot on the table. Something about the rosette had caught her eye during the auction. The faintest hairline crack in one of the scalloped edges, as though the embossing die had been slightly imperfect or overworn. She mentioned this observation to Lady Bantry, who examined the remaining rosettes with a frown. How odd, Jane. Miss Laura's work is usually flawless. Perhaps it was a flaw in that particular piece of paper. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her pale blue eyes remained thoughtful. as they gazed toward the distant spire of the lockkeeper's cottage. In her long experience, small imperfections often proved to be the loose threads that, when pulled, gently but persistently, unraveled much larger and more complex patterns. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and the village fete continued its pleasant progression through the rituals of English summer charity. But Miss Marple had learned over many decades of quiet observation that even the most innocent gatherings could harbor secrets as carefully sealed as any charity hamper. 14. Into that peculiar drowsiness that comes when the sun reaches its zenith, and the air grows thick with the scent of crushed grass and warm earth. Miss Marple had moved her chair slightly to catch the last cool breath of shade from the parish tent, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she observed the gradual dispersal of the fête crowd. Many of the successful bidders had departed with their mystery hampers, eager to discover the treasures within. The remaining villagers clustered around the tea stall and the cake competition, their voices creating a pleasant murmur that blended with the drone of bees among the late roses. It was James, Lady Bantry's elderly butler, who first drew attention to the peculiarities of Hamper 14. He had returned from loading Bellamy's prize into the London columnist's motor car, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said to Lady Bantry, removing his white cotton gloves and flexing his fingers with obvious relief. That hamper of Mr. Bellamy's was uncommonly heavy, near-strained. My back getting it into his boot. Lady Bantry looked up from the account book where she was recording the afternoon's successful bids. Heavy, James. How curious. Do you suppose someone was overly generous with their contributions? More than generous, my lady. Felt like it had a brick or two at the bottom. Made quite a thud when I set it down in his motor. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Her experience, seemingly casual observations often prove significant, particularly when they concerned objects that would soon disappear from immediate scrutiny. "Did Mr. Bellamy comment on the weight?" she inquired gently. James considered this carefully, as befitting a man who had spent decades in service learning the value of precision in domestic observations. "He did about it, Miss Marple. Said he'd make a column out of it, whatever that might mean in newspaper terms. Seemed right pleased with his purchase, though he did handle it careful, like when he was positioning it for that photograph he insisted upon." Miss Laura, who had been organizing her remaining rosettes and sealing materials nearby, looked up with interest. "A photograph. How delightfully modern. I'd hope he captures the craftsmanship of our seals. Each one represents considerable attention to detail, professional habit, I imagine," Lady Bantry observed. "Food columnists must document everything for their readers, though I confess I'm slightly nervous about what Mr. Bellamy might write." His manner suggested a certain metropolitan skepticism about our rural customs. Tom Quill, who had been listening, while packing his tools, straightened with a touch of professional pride. "Wounded. Nothing wrong with proper country craftsmanship, begging your pardon, Lady Bantry. That basket's as solid as they come. If it's heavy, that's because whoever filled it knew quality when they saw it." Councillor Ashcroft, overhearing this exchange, approached with the eager expression of a man sensing an opportunity for self-promotion. "I do hope Mr. Bellamy appreciates the innovative nature of our sealed auction concept. It could become a model for charitable organizations throughout the county. Imagine the publicity of his column sparks wider adoption of our methods." Miss Marple observed the interplay of expressions around this little group with the quiet attention. Phone, who had long since learned that human nature revealed itself most clearly in unguarded moments. There was Tom's honest craftsman's pride, Lady Bantry's hostess anxiety, Miss Laura's professional concern for her sealing work, and Ashcroft's transparent ambition. All perfectly natural reactions, yet something in the combination struck her as worth remembering. "Where did Mr. Bellamy say he was taking his hamper?" she asked, her tone carrying no more than polite interest. "Ferryman's Lock," Lady Bantry replied. "He mentioned wanting a quiet spot for his picnic where he could photograph the hamper properly before the official unsealing. Apparently, his readers expect comprehensive documentation of his culinary adventures." Miss Laura nodded approvingly. "Very proper of him to wait for 4 EO. The integrity of our sealed auction depends entirely upon maintaining the mystery until the designated time. I made that quite clear when I explained our procedures." "Fortnight," Miss Marple murmured, glancing at the small gold watch pinned to her cardigan. "That gives him just over 2 hours for his photography and contemplation. Quite sufficient time for a professional assessment, I should think." James had returned to his duties, but not before sharing one final observation. "Begging your pardon, but that Mr. Bellamy did seem particular about examining the hamper before I loaded it. Ran his hands all around the edges like testing the seals," he said, "to ensure they were properly done." Miss Laura flushed with professional pride. "I should hope they passed his inspection. Each gummed strip is applied with mathematical precision, and the rosettes are pressed with exactly the correct pressure to ensure a clear watermark, without damaging the paper structure. Most thorough," Miss Marple agreed, though her pale blue eyes held a thoughtful quality that suggested her mind was working along lines not immediately apparent to her companions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haddock, who approached their little group with the comfortable stride of a man who had served as the village's medical officer for more years than anyone cared to count. His weathered face bore the satisfied expression of one who had just enjoyed an excellent tea. "Splendid turnout today, Dolly," he said to Lady Bantry. "And that innovation of the sealed hampers has created quite a buzz. I've heard nothing but praise for the organization and execution." "All credit to our committee," Lady Bantry replied graciously. "Miss Laura's expertise with the sealing, Tom's beautiful baskets, and Counselor Ashcroft's promotional efforts have made it a genuine success." "Indeed," Dr. Haddock agreed. "Though I confess, I'm curious about the contents of some of those hampers." The widow Peterson's contribution looked suspiciously light, while young Mrs. Carmichael seemed packed to bursting, and that heavy one the London fellow purchased. "What number was it?" 14, replied Miss Laura promptly. Mr. Bellamy seemed quite pleased with his choice despite the weight James mentioned. Dr. Haddock's medical training had taught him to notice physical details that others might miss. Heavy, was it? Odd thing for a picnic hamper. One would expect delicacies and treats, not ballast. Perhaps someone included a bottle or two of something substantial. "The mystery will be solved at 4, Ashcroft said with the enthusiasm of one anticipating vindication of his promotional efforts. "I do hope Mr. Bellamy will share his findings with the committee. A professional food critic's assessment of our local contributions could prove invaluable for future events." Miss Marple had been listening to this exchange while her fingers worked, automatically with the knitting needles, her mind cataloging each detail for future reference. The weight of the hamper, Bellamy's careful examination of the seals, his insistence on proper photographic documentation, and his choice of the secluded lock for his solitary picnic, all innocent enough individually, yet somehow forming a pattern that nagged at her consciousness. "I believe I shall take a little constitutional before the afternoon grows too warm," she announced, rising from her chair with a careful deliberation of advanced years. "The towpath to Ferryman's Lock has always been one of my favorite walks." Lady Bantry looked concerned. "Are you quite sure, Jane? It's rather a distance, and this heat can be deceptive." "Quite sure, dear. A gentle walk will do me good. and I confess to ascertain curiosity about how Mr. Bellamy's professional assessment proceeds. One so rarely has the opportunity to observe a London critic at work in natural conditions. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared for her expedition, she reflected on the curious weight of hamper 14 and the careful attention its purchaser had paid to examining the seals that were meant to preserve its mysteries until the appointed hour. In her long experience, when someone took unusual interest in the security measures surrounding a secret, it often indicated that they possessed knowledge not available to their interested parties. The afternoon sun had begun its gradual decline toward the western horizon, and the shadows were starting to lengthen across the village green as Miss Marple set off down the lane toward Ferryman's Lock, her sensible shoes making no sound on the dusty path. To Ferryman's Lock wound through meadows that shimmered in the afternoon heat, following the gentle curves of the stream that had carved its way through the countryside for centuries beyond counting. Miss Marple walked with the measured pace of one who had learned to conserve energy while maintaining steady progress, her sharp eyes taking in the familiar landmarks that marked her route. The old mill house stood silent in its housing, green with moss and disuse. Beyond it, the path narrowed as it approaches the lock itself, where a low stone coping marked the boundary between the towpath and the deeper water that fed the ancient mechanism. It was a peaceful spot favored by anglers and the occasional artist, seeking inspiration from the interplay of light and shadow on moving water. As Miss Marple rounded the final bend, considering how best to convey the tragic news, in her experience, sudden death required careful handling, particularly when the deceased was a visitor whose presence had generated considerable local interest. "I'm afraid there's been an accident at Ferryman's Lock," she said gently. "Mr. Bellamy has drowned." The effect of this announcement rippled through the small group gathered around the tent. Lady Bantry's hand flew to her throat. Miss Laura dropped Theraset she had been collecting, and Councillor Ashcroft's face assumed the expression of a man calculating political implications. Drowned. Lady Bantry's voice carried the shock of one who had exchanged pleasantries with the victim mere hours earlier. But how? He seemed perfectly capable of looking after himself. Miss Marple provided a careful account of the scene at the lock, omitting her own observations about details that had struck her as unusual. Inspector Slack's conclusion of accidental death was accepted with the mixture of sadness and resignation that greets unexpected tragedy in small communities. "Such a terrible thing," Miss Laura murmured, her nervous fingers whirring at the edge of her cardigan, and he seemed so pleased with his hamper. "To think that his professional assessment will never be completed." It was this comment that provided Miss Marple with the opening she had been seeking. "Miss Laura, I wonder if I might trouble you for a small favor. Your expertise with sealing materials has been much admired today, and I confess to a certain curiosity about the techniques involved." Miss Laura's anxious expression brightened at this recognition of her professional skills. "Certainly, Miss Marple. I should be delighted to explain our methods. Quality control is essential in my line of work." She led Miss Marple to the small table where her sealing materials remained, arranged with methodical precision. The wooden box contained several compartments, each housing different elements of her craft: rolls of gummed paper strips, pots of various pastes and adhesives, and the metal embossing die that created the distinctive rosettes. "The gummed strips are quite traditional," Miss Laura explained with professional pride. "A blend of gum arabic and almond extract that provides both adhesion and a pleasant, subtle fragrance. I order them specially from a firm in London that supplies government offices." Miss Marple accepted a sample strip toe examine, noting the way it felt between her fingers and the faint, sweet scent that Miss Laura had mentioned. Quite sophisticated, and the rosettes, each one individually embossed with this dye. Miss Laura demonstrated the process on a spare piece of heavy paper. The pressure must be exactly correct to achieve the proper depth without tearing the paper. Too light and the watermark won't show clearly. Too heavy and the paper structure is compromised. Miss Marple held the sample rosette to the light, observing the crisp Laura and STMM watermark that appeared when properly illuminated. The embossing was indeed flawless, each scalloped edge perfectly defined. "Quite beautiful work," she observed. "I noticed Lady Bantry has some spare rosettes in her box there. Might I compare the quality?" Lady Bantry produced the box of unused rosettes, and Miss Marple examined several specimens with the careful attention of a connoisseur. The contrast was immediately apparent. These showed none of the hairline crack in the scalloped edge that she had observed on hamper 14's rosette during the auction. "Remarkable consistency," she commented. "Your quality control is evidently very thorough, Miss Laura." As she returned the samples, Miss Marple's fingers encountered something caught in the wicker of the spare rosette box. A tiny flake of dried adhesive that had apparently fallen from one of the gummed strips. She palmed it discreetly, her expression revealing nothing of the interest this discovery had sparked. "I do hope the tragic events won't reflect poorly on our charitable efforts," Counselor Ashcroft interjected, with transparent concern for his promotional schemes. Mr. Bellamy's column was to have featured our innovative auction concept prominently. "I'm sure Inspector Slack's investigation will confirm that the accident bears no relation to our fate activities," Lady Bantry replied with the firmness of one defending her organizational abilities. "Poor Mr. Bellamy's misfortune was simply a case of unfamiliar surroundings and treacherous footing." Miss Marple excused herself shortly thereafter, citing fatigue after her afternoon walk, but rather than returning directly home, she made a brief detour to her cottage garden, where she subjected the flake of dried adhesive to careful examination in the stronger light of her kitchen window. The fragment was small, no larger than a pinhead, but it possessed characteristics that struck her as significant. When moistened with a drop of water, its edge took on a distinctive pearlescent quality that spoke of fresh preparation rather than prolonged storage. The texture, too, seemed somehow different from the sample Miss Laura had shown her, less uniform, as though it had been applied under less than optimal conditions. In her long experience with the minutiae of domestic life, Miss Marple had learned that substances behave differently depending on the circumstances of their use. Fresh paste, applied carefully, would set quite differently from paste applied hastily, or under pressure of time. The small flakes suggested haste rather than the methodical precision that characterized Miss Laura's demonstrated technique. As evening shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair beside the window, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm, while her mind worked through the implications of the day's observations. The clay smear on hamper 14, the hairline crack in its rosette that had been absent from the spare samples, and now this fragment of what appeared to be hastily applied adhesive. Individually, each might be explained by innocent circumstances. Collectively, they formed a pattern that suggested a story quite different from the tragic accident that had satisfied Inspector Slack's investigation. In the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the sealed hamper that had sat so peacefully beside the scene of tragedy, its blue bow perfectly tied and its rosette undisturbed. She thought of professional food critics and their methodical approaches to assessment, of heavy baskets that required careful handling, and of seals that were meant to preserve mysteries until the appointed hour. Most particularly, she thought about the pearlescent edge of dried paste that suggested recent application rather than the morning's careful preparation. And she wondered exactly when and under what circumstances that particular fragment had found its way into the wicker of a spare rosette box that should have contained only unused materials. The evening air carried the scent of roses from her garden, But Miss Marple found herself remembering instead the subtle fragrance of gum arabic and almond that had characterized Miss Laura's sealing paste, and wondering whether that same distinctive scent might have lingered about hamper 14 during its mysterious sojourn at Ferryman's Lock. The following morning dawned with a peculiar clarity that sometimes follows tragic events, as though nature itself sought to compensate for human misfortune. With perfect weather, Miss Marple rose early, her mind already occupied with the various inconsistencies that had troubled her sleep, and set about her morning routine with the methodical precision of one who had learned to use routine as a framework for deeper contemplation. After breakfast, she made her way to the village, ostensibly to purchase writing paper at Miss Laura's stationery shop, but actually driven by a growing conviction that the events at Ferryman's Lock required further investigation. The shop stood on the corner of the High Street, its windows displaying the orderly arrangements of pens, papers, and office supplies that had served St. Mary Mead's correspondence needs for the better part of 2 decades. Miss Laura was behind the counter, her nervous energy finding outlet in the unnecessary rearrangement of inventory that had been perfectly ordered the day before. Her greeting carried the strained quality of one whose sleep had been disturbed by unwelcome thoughts. "Miss Marple, how good of you to call. I've been quite unable to settle since yesterday's dreadful news. To think that poor Mr. Bellamy met such a tragic end so soon after purchasing our hamper." Miss Marple expressed appropriate sympathy while examining the various papers and materials on display. "I confess I've been unable to stop thinking about the afternoon's events myself. The human mind seems compelled to seek patterns and explanations, even when tragedy appears entirely accidental." Miss Laura's hands fluttered nervously among the papers. Inspector Slack seemed quite satisfied with his conclusions, though I suppose one cannot help wondering about the details. Professional curiosity, you understand, whether our sealing held properly throughout Mr. Bellamy's transportation and handling of the hamper. This comment provided Miss Marple with the opening she'd been seeking. "Indeed, the integrity of your seals was quite remarkable. I remember being struck by how perfectly preserved they appeared, even after the tragic circumstances. Might I trouble you to show me your rosette book? I find myself curious about the numbering system you employed." Miss Laura produced a large bound volume from beneath the counter, its pages filled with perforated rosettes in numerical sequence. She expected to see Mr. Bellamy seated comfortably beside his hamper, perhaps making notes for his column, or arranging his photographic equipment. Instead, she was greeted by a scene that made her quicken her step despite her years. Voices carried across the water, urgent, alarmed voices that spoke of crisis and confusion. A small group had gathered near the lock, and as Miss Marple drew closer, she could distinguish the figures of the lock-keeper and 2 young men who appeared to be day trippers, their fishing rods abandoned on the bank. "Here now, what's all this?" The voice belonged to Constable Polk, who was approaching from the opposite direction with the heavy tread of authority reluctantly summoned from Sunday afternoon repose. Miss Marple arrived at the scene to find Mr. Cyrus Bellamy lying face down at the water's edge, his linen suit dark with moisture, and his sharp features unnaturally still. The lock-keeper, a weathered man named Higgins, was wringing his hands with the distress of one whose peaceful domain had been disrupted by tragedy. "Found him just like this," one of the young anglers was explaining to Constable Polk. "Came around the bend not 10 minutes ago, and there he was, floating face down near the coping. We pulled him out, but it was too late." Miss Marple approached with the quiet authority that her reputation in St. Mary Mead afforded her, and Constable Polk nodded respectfully as she examined the scene with her experienced eye. Bellamy's head bore a single crescent-shaped bruise above his left temple, the mark dark against his pale skin. The injury appeared consistent with a sharp blow from something curved and unyielding, such as the low stone coping that ran along the water's edge. Slippery clay on these stones, Higgins was explaining to anyone who would listen. Been warning folks about it for years. One careless step in them leather sole shoes and down you go. Seen it happen before, though not with such a tragic end. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to something that struck her as remarkable given the circumstances. There, sitting peacefully on the grass some yards from the water's edge, was Hamper 14. The blue silk bow remained perfectly intact. The embossed rosette showed no sign of disturbance, and the gummed paper strip that sealed the lid appeared completely unbroken. "Curious," she murmured to herself, though Constable Polk's sharp ears caught the comment. "What's curious, Miss Marple?" The Hamper constable. "If Mr. Bellamy suffered a fall near the water's edge, one might expect some disturbance to his possessions. Yet, the basket sits quite undisturbed, as though it had been carefully placed rather than abandoned in a moment of crisis." Constable Polk scratched his head beneath his helmet. Perhaps he set it down before the accident. Natural thing to do if you're arranging a picnic spot. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though her pale blue eyes continued their methodical examination of the scene. She moved slowly around the hamper, her keen gaze noting every detail. It was then that she observed something that made her pause. On the back corner of the wicker basket, barely visible unless one looked from precisely the right angle, was a small smear of the fine clay that Higgins had mentioned. The clay was of the particular type that clung to the stone coping, pale yellow, with a slightly greasy texture that marked it as belonging to the water side rather than the drier earth of the towpath proper. "Has anyone disturbed the hamper since Mr. Bellamy's body was discovered?" she inquired gently. The young anglers shook their heads vigorously. "Wouldn't dream of touching it, ma'am." "Knew there'd be questions asked," Higgins concurred. "Left everything just as we found it, though I did notice the hamper sitting there neat as you please when we first spotted the gentleman in the water. Struck me as odd at the time, but I was more concerned with the emergency at hand." Constable Polk had been examining the immediate area around Bellamy's body, and his findings supported the theory of accidental death. "No sign of a struggle," he reported. "Looks straightforward enough. Gentleman comes down for a quiet picnic, sets down his basket, steps too close to the edge on slippery stone, takes a tumble, strikes his head on the way down, and drowns while stunned." Miss Marple continued her careful examination, noting the position of Bellamy's camera, which lay near his body with its leather strap still around his wrist. The final exposure showed the hamper positioned exactly as it now sits, though something about the rosette's alignment in the photograph seemed subtly different from its current position. "Inspector Slack will need Toby summoned," Constable Polk was saying as he covered the body with his cape. "Though I dare say he'll reach the same conclusion. Tragic accident, but nothing more sinister than carelessness on Whetstone." As if conjured by the mention of his name, Inspector Slack appeared on the towpath, his off-duty attire of sports jacket and flannels, lending him an air of irritated informality. His face bore the expression of a man whose Sunday afternoon had been rudely interrupted by the inconsiderate behavior of the deceased. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, surveying the scene with a weary eye of one who had seen too many such incidents. "Tourist takes a tumble, I suppose. Always happens when city folk try to commune with nature." Constable Polk provided a concise summary of the discovery and the apparent circumstances, while Inspector Slack examined the body with perfunctory thoroughness. His conclusion matched that of the constable. Accidental death by drowning following a blow to the head sustained in a fall. Straightforward enough, Slack pronounced with satisfaction. We'll have the body removed and the scene cleared. No point in making a production of simple misfortune. Miss Marple had remained silent during this official assessment, but as the inspector prepared to seal off the area pending the arrival of the coroner, she ventured a gentle observation. "Inspector, I wonder if I might draw your attention to a small detail that seems somewhat unusual." Slack turned with a barely concealed impatience of an official who had reached his conclusions and was eager to complete the necessary paperwork. "Yes, Miss Marple, the clay on the hamper's corner. It appears to be of the same composition as that found on the stone coping where Mr. Bellamy struck his head. Yet the basket sits well away from the water's edge on dry ground that shows no similar clay deposits." Inspector Slack glanced at the smear Miss Marple indicated, his expression suggesting that he found the observation less significant than she appeared to consider it. "Probably got clay on it when the gentleman set it down earlier," he said dismissively. "Or perhaps when the lockkeeper was moving about during the rescue attempt," Higgins protested immediately. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but I never went near that basket. Was too busy with the poor gentleman to pay it any mind." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though she made no further comment as Inspector Slack proceeded with his official duties. The scene was duly photographed, measurements taken, and statements recorded from all witnesses. By the time the coroner's vehicle had departed with its sad burden, the afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably. As the small crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained behind for a few moments, studying the peaceful scene that had been so recently disturbed by tragedy. The hamper sat in its original position, still sealed and mysterious, a silent witness to events that had culminated in death beside the ancient lock. In her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature, Miss Marple had learned to distrust scenes that appeared too neatly arranged, explanations that seemed too readily apparent, and accidents that left certain details unexplained. The fine clay on Hamper 14's corner was such a detail, and as she began her return journey to St. Mary Mead, she found herself wondering exactly how and when that particular smear had found its way onto the wicker surface. Mary Mead passed in contemplative silence. Miss Marple's measured steps kept time with thoughts that circled around the tragic scene at Ferryman's Lock, like moths around a candle flame. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward evening, casting longer shadows across the meadows, and lending a golden quality to the light that filtered through the hedge. By the time she reached the village green, the charity fete had begun its gradual transformation from bustling community gathering to the quiet aftermath of successful enterprise. Most of the hampers had been claimed by their purchasers. The tea stalls were being emptied, and the bunting hung slightly less crisply in the still air. Lady Bantry stood beside the parish tent, directing the packing of unsold items with the efficiency of one long practiced in the management of village affairs. Her face brightened as she spotted Miss Marple approaching, though concern quickly replaced pleasure as she noted her friend's grave expression. "Jane, dear, you look quite solemn. I do hope your constitutional proved refreshing." Miss Marple paused. Each page contained multiple circles, and Miss Marple could see where various numbers had been carefully removed for use in the auction. "Each rosette is numbered consecutively," Miss Laura explained, turning to the relevant page. "Here you can see where 14 was removed from Mr. Bellamy's hamper." Miss Marple examined the page carefully, noting the neat removal of rosette 14 and the precise tick mark that indicated its use. But as her eyes continued down the page, she made a discovery that sent a small thrill of recognition through her consciousness. There, still partially attached to the page by its perforations, was a second rosette, numbered 14. The die-cutting process had apparently created a duplicate, and while one had been removed and used, the other remained in the book, half perforated, and easily overlooked unless one examined the page with particular attention. "How curious," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It appears the printing process created 2 14s on this page." Miss Laura leaned forward to examine the page, her expression showing genuine surprise. "How extraordinary. I pride myself on careful inventory control, but I must have missed that duplication entirely. The embossing die must have struck twice in that position." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though her attention had been caught by another detail. The second rosette 14, while identical in number and general appearance to its used counterpart, showed none of the hairline crack in the scalloped edge that she had observed on the hamper during the auction. After completing her purchase of writing paper, Miss Marple took her customary morning walk, but instead of following her usual route through the village lanes, she found herself drawn once again toward Ferryman's Lock. The scene had been cleared by the authorities, and the towpath showed no signs of the previous day's tragedy beyond the official tape that marked the area as temporarily restricted. She proceeded carefully along the hedge that bordered the towpath, her eyes scanning the ground for any detail that might have escaped official notice. It was near the spot where the path curved toward the lock itself that she made her discovery. Caught among the lower branches of a hawthorn hedge was a small crescent of heavy paper, torn along one edge as though it had been forcibly separated from something larger. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, noting its quality and texture, which matched exactly the material used for Miss Laura's rosettes. More significant still was the tiny pinhole that pierced the fragment near its torn edge, and the smear of blue silk fiber that clung to its surface. The pinhole suggested that the fragment had once been attached to something by means of a small fastener, while the silk fiber was unmistakably similar to the material used for the auction bows. Miss Marple wrapped the fragment carefully in her handkerchief and continued her examination of the area. The official investigation had focused primarily on the immediate vicinity of the tragedy, but her more systematic search of the wider area yielded additional evidence that Inspector Slack's team had overlooked. Near the base of the hedge, partially concealed by fallen leaves, she discovered what appeared to be a small brass pin of the type used in crafts and light manufacturing. Its surface showed traces of blue silk and paper fibers, suggesting it had recently been employed to fasten such materials together. The pattern that had been forming in Miss Marple's mind since the previous afternoon was beginning to crystallize into something approaching certainty. The duplicate rosette in Miss Laura's book, the paper fragment with its pinhole and silk fibers, and the brass pin with its telltale traces all pointed toward a sequence of events quite different from the accidental death that had satisfied official investigation. As she made her way back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the implications of her discoveries. Someone had possessed access to Miss Laura's rosette book and had prepared a second number 14 rosette for purposes that remained unclear. That someone had also had opportunity to handle the materials used in the auction sealing process and had taken considerable care to remove evidence of their activities from the immediate scene. The fragment of rosette paper had not found its way into the hedge by accident. It bore the characteristics of something that had been hastily disposed of during a moment of crisis or discovery. The pinhole and silk fibers suggested that someone had been engaged in the delicate work of reattaching or placing the decorative elements of a sealed hamper, work that would require both skill and familiarity with the materials involved. Most troubling of all was the implication that this work had been performed at or near the scene of Mr. Bellamy's death during the narrow window of time between his departure from the village fete and the discovery of his body by the young anglers. Miss Marple's pace quickened slightly as she considered the full ramifications of these discoveries. If her growing suspicions proved correct, then Mr. Bellamy's death had been no accident, and someone in St. Mary Mead possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to have engineered a deception that had fooled even Inspector Slack's experienced. The question that remained was why anyone would have taken such elaborate precautions to maintain the apparent integrity of a sealed hamper, while committing what was beginning to appear as something far more sinister than simple misadventure. Beside an ancient lock, Miss Marple's return to the village coincided with the morning rush of activity that marked the beginning of another working week. The tragedy at Ferryman's Lock had become the primary topic of conversation, discussed in hushed tones outside the baker's shop and analyzed with the thorough attention that small communities devote to unexpected events. She found Tom Quill in his workshop behind the high street, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade. The scent of willow and cane filled the air, mingling with the sharper odor of varnish and brass polish. Tom himself stood at his workbench, methodically checking the handles of a half-finished basket, with the careful attention of a craftsman whose reputation depended upon quality. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had endured criticism and was prepared to defend his work against all comers. The whispered suggestions that his hampers might have contributed to the tragedy had clearly reached his ears, and his professional pride had been stung accordingly. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening as she entered the workshop, "come to see where the fault lies, have you? Well, you'll find none here. 40 years I've been making baskets for this village, and never a complaint about the construction." Miss Marple's gentle manner and genuine interest in craftsmanship quickly disarmed his defensive attitude. "I'm sure your work is beyond reproach, Mr. Quill. Indeed, I've come because I'm curious about the construction techniques involved. Such beautiful workmanship deserves to be properly understood." Tom's expression softened at this recognition of his skills. Like most artisans, he took pleasure in explaining the intricacies of his craft to an appreciative audience. "Well then, you've come to the right place. These willow and cane picnic models are built to last generations. See here." He lifted one of the completed hampers from his workbench, running his fingers along the woven sides with obvious pride. Every joint properly seated, every handle mounted with brass fittings that won't work loose. Miss Marple examined the basket with the attention of a connoisseur, noting the precision of the weaving and the quality of the metalwork. The handle construction appears particularly robust. I imagine it must bear considerable weight when the basket is fully loaded. "Aye, that it does. These secrets in the hinge bar system." Tom indicated the brass rod that ran through the handle blocks connecting the two sides of the carrying mechanism. "This bar takes all the stress, distributes it evenly across the frame. But there's more to it than simple strength." He moved to another basket, this one an older model that showed signs of use and minor repair. "See these split pins that hold the hinge bar in place? Remove one of these little fellows and you can lay the handle flat against the side. When you do that, this side panel here." He demonstrated the action as he spoke, and Miss Marple watched with fascination as the side of the basket hinged outward by perhaps 2 inches. "Remarkable," she observed. "The opening appears quite narrow, but sufficient for a slender hand to reach inside." "Exactly. So it's a design feature for those who know about it. Allows access for cleaning or small repairs without removing the light entirely. But you'd need to know the trick, and you'd need a thin tool to work the pin free. Can't be done with thick fingers." Miss Marple's pulse quickened at this revelation, though her expression remained serenely interested. "What sort of tool would be required?" Tom scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Something long and thin with a bit of strength to it. Knitting needle might do, or a crochet hook. Ladies' hat pin if they still made them proper, anything that could get purchase on the pin and work it free without damaging the mechanism. As if summoned by this mention of ladies' implements, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Laura, who appeared in the workshop doorway with a parcels bag in her hand and an expression of determined cheerfulness that seemed somewhat forced. "Mr. Quill, I do hope you're not allowing yesterday's unfortunate events to discourage you. The committee has complete confidence in your craftsmanship." Tom's jaw set stubbornly. "Don't need no committee to tell me my work sound. Been explaining to Miss Marple here how these baskets are built. Nothing wrong with the construction that could have contributed to that poor gentleman's accident." Miss Laura's nervous smile flickered as she glanced between Tom and Miss Marple. "Of course not, though I confess I've been quite distressed by some of the gossip circulating in the village. People seem determined to find complications where none exist." Miss Marple observed the stationer's agitated manner with interest. "Indeed, tragedy often breeds speculation, though I must say, Mr. Quill's explanation of the basket construction has been most illuminating. Such ingenious craftsmanship, the way the side panel can be accessed without disturbing the lid seal." Miss Laura's bag shifted in her grip, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of its contents. Spare rosettes, a small bottle that might have contained adhesive, and something that appeared to be made of bone or ivory. The last item was partially concealed, but its curved shape suggested the sort of tool that Tom had just described. "You seem well prepared for craft work yourself, Miss Laura," Miss Marple observed with gentle interest. "Oh, this just some repair supplies for the parish notice board. The weather has been so damp lately, and paper notices require frequent attention." Miss Laura's explanation came rather too quickly, and she clutched the bag closer to her body as she spoke. Tom had returned to his demonstration, apparently oblivious to the tension that had crept into the conversation. "Nasty business, if someone was to use Thetric maliciously," he grumbled, working the split pin back into position. "But you'd have to know exactly what you were about, and you'd need proper tools, crochet hook or such like." Miss Marple's memory stirred at this repeated mention of crochet hooks. During the fete, she had observed Miss Laura's knitting bag sitting beside her sealing materials, and she distinctly recalled glimpsing what had appeared to be a bone crochet hook among its contents. "Do you do much crochet work, Miss Laura?" she inquired, with a casual interest of one craftswoman speaking to another. Miss Laura's nervous flutter increased visibly. "A little, nothing elaborate, simple edgings and such helps pass the long evenings. How useful to have multiple skills. Crochet hooks are so versatile, useful for all sorts of delicate work beyond their intended purpose." The comment seemed to strike Miss Laura with unexpected force. Her face paled slightly, and she took a step backward toward the workshop door. "I really must be going. So much to attend to after yesterday's disruption. Good day, Mr. Quill. Miss Marple." She departed with unseemly haste, leaving Miss Marple and Tom Quill to exchange glances of mild surprise. "Nervous sort is Miss Laura," Tom observed. "Always has been, but she seemed particularly jumpy since yesterday. Suppose the tragedy has affected everyone differently." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind working through the implications of what she had just learned. The basket construction that Tom demonstrated provided a method by which someone could access the contents of a sealed hamper without disturbing the lid or breaking the obvious seals. All that would be required was knowledge of the mechanism, access to a suitable tool, and the opportunity to work unobserved. Miss Laura possessed detailed knowledge of the sealing system, had demonstrated familiarity with the materials involved, and carried in her bag what appeared to be exactly the sort of tool that would be needed for the delicate work of manipulating the split-pin mechanism. Most significantly, her reaction to the mention of crochet hooks had shown all the signs of guilty knowledge, the sort of involuntary response that Miss Marple had learned to recognize over many years of observing human nature under stress. As she thanked Tom Quill for his illuminating demonstration and took her leave of the workshop, Miss Marple found herself considering the growing body of evidence that pointed toward a deliberate deception rather than simple accident. The question that remained was what had been concealed within hamper 14 that was worth the considerable risk of tampering with its seals beside the dangerous waters of Ferryman's Loch. The decision to maintain a watch at Ferryman's Loch had not come easily to Miss Marple. At her age, nocturnal expeditions were neither comfortable nor entirely prudent, but the accumulating evidence of deliberate deception demanded action that could not wait for official channels to reach the same conclusions. She had approached Sergeant Lake with her concerns during the late afternoon, presenting her discoveries with the careful precision of one who understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. To his credit, the sergeant had listened with the attention due to Miss Marple's reputation for shrewd observation, though his expression suggested considerable skepticism about the implications she drew from the evidence. "You're suggesting that someone tampered with the hamper after Mr. Bellamy's death?" he had asked, reviewing the paper fragment and the brass pin she had recovered from the hedge. "I'm suggesting that someone had reason to ensure the hamper appeared undisturbed, regardless of when that injuring took place," Miss Marple had replied diplomatically. "Whether before or after the tragedy, such behavior warrants investigation." The compromise they had reached involved a discreet observation post among the alders that grew beside the towpath. If Miss Marple's suspicions proved correct, and someone felt compelled to return to the scene, they would be ready. If nothing occurred, no harm would be done beyond the loss of a night's sleep. Now, as the church clock struck 11, Miss Marple sat, wrapped in her warmest cloak among the rustling leaves, her keen eyes fixed on the moonlit expanse of the loch and its surroundings. Sergeant Lake had positioned himself further along the path, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough away to avoid the impression of an official trap. The night was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of water moving through the ancient mechanism, and the occasional rustle of small creatures going about their nocturnal business. Miss Marple had brought her knitting, finding that the familiar rhythm of the needles helped maintain alertness during the long watch. It was nearly midnight when she detected the first signs of human presence. A figure approached along the towpath, from the direction of the village, moving with the careful steps of one who wished to avoid detection. The moonlight revealed the outline of a woman carrying what appeared to be a substantial bag or parcel. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as the figure drew closer and resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of Miss Laura. The stationer moved directly to the spot where Bellamy's body had been discovered, setting down her burden and beginning what appeared to be a systematic search of the immediate area. The activity continued for several minutes, with Miss Laura examining the ground near the water's edge and among the reeds that grew beside the loch. Her movements suggested familiarity with the location and purpose in her search, as though she sought something specific that might have been overlooked during the official investigation. It was at this point that Sergeant Lake emerged from his concealment, his official voice cutting through the quiet night air. "Here now, what's all this? You're trespassing on a sealed crime scene, miss." Miss Laura started violently, nearly losing her balance on the slippery stones beside the water. "Oh, Sergeant Lake, you gave me such a fright. I was only, that is, I thought." "I might what exactly?" The sergeant's tone carried the authority of official suspicion as he approached with measured steps. Miss Marple emerged from her own hiding place, her appearance adding to Miss Laura's obvious distress. The stationer's face, pale in the moonlight, showed all the signs of someone whose careful plans had gone badly awry. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect. That is, I merely came to tidy any litter that might have been left by the reporters. Such people have no respect for the natural beauty of our countryside." Sergeant Lake examined the bag Miss Laura had brought, his expression growing increasingly serious as he catalogued its contents. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with a quiet attention of one whose suspicions were being systematically confirmed. "Spare rosettes," the sergeant announced, lifting each item for examination. One of them stamped with the number 14, a small bottle containing what appears to be adhesive. "And this." He held up a bone crochet hook that gleamed dully in the moonlight. "What would you be wanting with these items at midnight beside a sealed crime scene?" Miss Laura's composure crumbled entirely under this direct questioning. Her hands fluttered nervously as she sought explanations that would not come. "The rosettes are just spares from yesterday's auction, and the hook is simply. I always carry it for emergencies. You never know when something might need mending." At midnight, in a restricted area, Sergeant Lake's skepticism was evident in every word. Miss Marple approached the trembling woman with the gentle manner that had served her well in previous encounters with guilty consciences. "Miss Laura, I think perhaps it would be wise to tell us exactly why you felt compelled to return here tonight. The truth, however difficult, is often less damaging than the alternatives." The stationer's resistance collapsed entirely at this kindly spoken suggestion. "I thought I might have dropped something yesterday when I came to check on the hamper. After the accident, I was so distressed by the tragedy that I might have been careless." "You came here yesterday?" Sergeant Lake's voice sharpened with professional interest. "You didn't mention that in your statement to Inspector Slack." "I didn't think it important. I only stayed a moment just to ensure that our ceiling work hadn't been damaged in all the commotion." Miss Marple examined the crochet hook. Sergeant Lake had confiscated, noting the peculiar film that coated its curved end. When held to the moonlight, the substance showed the telltale pearlescent quality she had observed in the fragment found at the fete. "This appears to have traces of adhesive paste," she observed mildly. "Fresh paste, you should say, given its condition. One might wonder what sort of emergency mending would require such materials." Miss Laura's voice had become barely audible. "I can explain everything. It's not what you think. I never meant for anyone to be hurt." Sergeant Lake produced his notebook, with the satisfied expression of an officer whose patience had been rewarded. "Then I suggest you begin explaining, miss, and this time let's have the complete truth." As Miss Laura began her halting confession under the watchful eyes of the law, and the gentle encouragement of Miss Marple's understanding manner, the peaceful night air carried her words across the ancient lock where tragedy had struck less than 48 hours earlier. The truth, as Miss Marple had long observed, possessed a peculiar weight that distinguished it from even the most carefully constructed deceptions, and Miss Laura's burden was clearly becoming too heavy for her conscience to bear in silence. The following morning, Miss Laura's midnight apprehension dawned gray and overcast, as though the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Word of the arrest had spread through the village with a speed that only shocking news could achieve, leaving residents to grapple with that disturbing realization that tragedy had struck closer to home than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of official investigation, though this time, Inspector Slack's demeanor showed considerably less certainty than it had during his initial assessment of accidental death. The evidence recovered from Miss Laura's midnight expedition had forced a thorough reconsideration of the case, and the inspector's pride was clearly smarting from the recognition that his hasty conclusions had been premature. "Most irregular, Miss Marple," he grumbled as they stood outside Miss Laura's stationery shop, while Constable Polk conducted a systematic search of the premises. Civilian involvement in official investigation sets a dangerous precedent. Miss Marple accepted this criticism with her usual grace. Indeed, Inspector, though I trust the irregularity of the methods will be forgiven if they contribute to the discovery of truth. The search of the shop had already yielded significant results. In Miss Laura's small office, behind the main retail area, investigators had discovered a collection of items that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation and attempted concealment. Dr. Haddock emerged from the back room, his medical bag in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered features. "I've completed my examination of the deceased," he announced to the assembled group. "No traces of alcohol or poison in the system as we suspected. Death by drowning following. A head injury consistent with striking the stone coping. The bruise pattern matches perfectly." Inspector Slack nodded with satisfaction. At least that part of our original assessment was correct. The man drowned after hitting his head on the stones. The question, Miss Marple observed gently, is whether that contact was purely accidental or the result of other circumstances. It was at this moment that Constable Polk appeared from the rear of the building, his face bearing the expression of a man who had made an unpleasant discovery. In his hands he carried a small metal container that appeared to be some sort of portable brazier or fire pot. "Found this in the back garden, Inspector," Polk reported. "Been used recently by the look of it. Still some ashes in the bottom." "Inspector." Slack examined the container with growing interest. "What sort of ashes, Constable?" Polk produced a small evidence envelope containing several fragments of charred material. "Mostly paper, sir, but there's this as well." He held up a small piece of blue silk, its edges blackened by fire, but its color still clearly visible. The fragment was, perhaps an inch in length, and its ends had been cut with a precise straight edge that characterizes scissors rather than the bias cuts that Miss Marple had observed in Lady Bantry's bow work. "Silk ribbon," Miss Marple confirmed, examining the fragment with careful attention. Blue silk cut straight across rather than on the bias. Lady Bantry's bows were always finished with bias-cut tails. The significance of this discovery was not lost on Inspector Slack, whose expression showed the dawning realization that the case was proving far more complex than he had initially believed. Further examination of the ashes revealed additional fragments of burned paper, some bearing the telltale shimmer of watermark material. When held to the light, several pieces showed portions of the distinctive Laura and STMM marking that characterized the rosettes used in the charity auction. "She's been burning evidence," Inspector Slack concluded with grim satisfaction. "Paper rosettes and silk ribbon. The question is what she was trying to hide." The answer to that question came when Constable Polk made an additional discovery in Miss Laura's shop stove. Among the cold ashes of what had clearly been a recent fire, he found several more fragments of the heavy paper used for rosettes, along with the backing strip from a gummed seal. Miss Marple studied these remains with the focused attention of one who understood their significance. The backing from a gummed strip would only be removed if the strip itself were being reapplied, she observed. One doesn't normally preserve such waste material. Dr. Haddock, who had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension, shook his head with the disgust of a man confronting deliberate deception. "You're suggesting that Miss Laura tampered with a hamper after Bellamy's death, that she went to considerable trouble to make it appear undisturbed. The evidence certainly suggests careful preparation and subsequent concealment," Miss Marple replied diplomatically, "though the precise sequence of events remains to be determined." Inspector Slack had been making notes with methodical attention, of an officer who recognized that his initial assessment had been embarrassingly incomplete. We'll need to question Miss Laura again, this time with proper attention to the discrepancies in her story. The investigation continued throughout the morning, with each discovery adding another piece to the puzzle that was slowly revealing its complete picture. The burned ribbon with its straight-cut ends, the charred rosette fragments with their telltale watermarks, and the gummed strip backing all pointed toward a systematic effort to conceal evidence of tampering. Most damning of all was the condition of the crochet hook that had been found in Miss Laura's possession. Laboratory examination had confirmed the presence of the same gum, Arabic, and almond paste that characterized the official sealing materials, applied recently enough to retain its distinctive pearlescent quality when moistened. As the morning progressed and the weight of evidence mounted, Inspector Slack found himself facing the uncomfortable necessity of completely revising his initial conclusions about the death at Ferryman's Lock. What had appeared to be a straightforward accident was revealing itself as something far more sinister, involving careful premeditation and deliberate concealment. Miss Marple watched these developments with the quiet satisfaction of one whose patient observation had been vindicated by official investigation. The truth, as she had long observed, possessed a persistence that eventually overcame even the most careful attempts at concealment. Miss Laura's midnight expedition had provided the final confirmation needed to establish that Cyrus Bellamy's death was no accident. The question that remained was what had driven the nervous stationer to such desperate measures, and what secrets Hamper 14 had contained that were worth the terrible risk of murder beside the ancient waters of Ferryman's Lock. The afternoon sun struggled through the gray clouds as Miss Marple made her way to Dean, Lady Bantry's comfortable residence that had served as the administrative headquarters for the charity fete. The tragic events of the past few days had cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration of community spirit, and Lady Bantry's usually cheerful demeanor showed the strain of recent revelations. Inspector Slack had requested that Hamper 14 be brought to Dean for a final examination before Miss Laura's formal questioning. The rosettes are just spares from yesterday's auction, and the hook is simply, I always carry it for emergencies. You never know when something might need mending. At midnight, in a restricted area, Sergeant Lake's skepticism was evident in every word. Miss Marple approached the trembling woman with the gentle manner that had served her well in previous encounters with guilty consciences. Miss Laura, I think perhaps it would be wise to tell us exactly why you felt compelled to return here tonight. The truth, however difficult, is often less damaging than the alternatives. The stationer's resistance collapsed entirely at this kindly spoken suggestion. I thought I might have dropped something yesterday when I came to check on the hamper after the accident. I was so distressed by the tragedy that I might have been careless. You came here yesterday? Sergeant Lake's voice sharpened with professional interest. You didn't mention that in your statement to Inspector Slack. I didn't think it important. I only stayed a moment just to ensure that our sealing work hadn't been damaged in all the commotion. Miss Marple examined the crochet hook. Sergeant Lake had confiscated, noting the peculiar film that coated its curved end. When held to the moonlight, the substance showed the telltale pearlescent quality she had observed in the fragment found at the fete. This appears to have traces of adhesive paste, she observed mildly. Fresh paste, I should say, given its condition. One might wonder what sort of emergency mending would require such materials. Miss Laura's voice had become barely audible. I can explain everything. It's not what you think. I never meant for anyone to be hurt. Sergeant Lake produced his notebook, with the satisfied expression of an officer whose patience had been rewarded. Then I suggest you begin explaining, miss. And this time let's have the complete truth. As Miss Laura began her halting confession under the watchful eyes of the law, and the gentle encouragement of Miss Marple's understanding manner. The peaceful night air carried her words across the ancient lock where tragedy had struck less than 48 hours earlier. The truth, as Miss Marple had long observed, possessed a peculiar weight that distinguished it from even the most carefully constructed deceptions, and Miss Laura's burden was clearly becoming too heavy for her conscience to bear in silence. The following morning, Miss Laura's midnight apprehension dawned gray and overcast, as though the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Word of the arrest had spread through the village with a speed that only shocking news could achieve, leaving residents to grapple with that disturbing realization that tragedy had struck closer to home than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of official investigation, though this time, Inspector Slack's demeanor showed considerably less certainty than it had during his initial assessment of accidental death. The evidence recovered from Miss Laura's midnight expedition had forced a thorough reconsideration of the case, and the inspector's pride was clearly smarting from the recognition that his hasty conclusions had been premature. "Most irregular, Miss Marple," he grumbled as they stood outside Miss Laura's stationery shop, while Constable Polk conducted a systematic search of the premises. "Civilian involvement in official investigation sets a dangerous precedent." Miss Marple accepted this criticism with her usual grace. "Indeed, Inspector, though I trust the irregularity of the methods will be forgiven if they contribute to the discovery of truth." The search of the shop had already yielded significant results. In Miss Laura's small office behind the main retail area, investigators had discovered a collection of items that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation and attempted concealment. Dr. Haddock emerged from the back room, his medical bag in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered features. "I've completed my examination of the deceased," he announced to the assembled group. "No traces of alcohol or poison in the system as we suspected. Death by drowning following. A head injury consistent with striking the stone coping. The bruise pattern matches perfectly." Inspector Slack nodded with satisfaction. At least that part of our original assessment was correct. The man drowned after hitting his head on the stones. The question, Miss Marple observed gently, is whether that contact was purely accidental or the result of other circumstances. It was at this moment that Constable Polk appeared from the rear of the building, his face bearing the expression of a man who had made an unpleasant discovery. In his hands he carried a small metal container that appeared to be some sort of portable brazier or fire pot. "Found this in the back garden, Inspector," Polk reported. "Been used recently by the look of it. Still some ashes in the bottom, Inspector." Slack examined the container with growing interest. "What sort of ashes, Constable?" Polk produced a small evidence envelope containing several fragments of charred material. "Mostly paper, sir, but there's this as well." He held up a small piece of blue silk, its edges blackened by fire, but its color still clearly visible. The fragment was perhaps an inch in length, and its ends had been cut with a precise straight edge that characterizes scissors rather than the bias cuts that Miss Marple had observed in Lady Bantry's bowwork. "Silk ribbon," Miss Marple confirmed, examining the fragment with careful attention. "Blue silk cut straight across rather than on the bias. Lady Bantry's bows were always finished with bias-cut tails." The significance of this discovery was not lost on Inspector Slack, whose expression showed the dawning realization that the case was proving far more complex than he had initially believed. Further examination of the ashes revealed additional fragments of burned paper, some bearing the telltale shimmer of watermark material. When held to the light, several pieces showed portions of the distinctive Laura and STMM marking that characterized the rosettes used in the charity auction. She's been burning evidence, Inspector Slack concluded with grim satisfaction. Paper rosettes and silk ribbon. The question is what she was trying to hide. The answer to that question came when Constable Polk made an additional discovery in Miss Laura's shop stove. Among the cold ashes of what had clearly been a recent fire, he found several more fragments of the heavy paper used for rosettes, along with the backing strip from a gummed seal. Miss Marple studied these remains with the focused attention of one who understood their significance. The backing from a gummed strip would only be removed if the strip itself were being reapplied, she observed. One doesn't normally preserve such waste material. Dr. Haddock, who had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension, shook his head with the disgust of a man confronting deliberate deception. You're suggesting that Miss Laura tampered with the hamper after Bellamy's death, that she went to considerable trouble to make it appear undisturbed. The evidence certainly suggests careful preparation and subsequent concealment, Miss Marple replied diplomatically, though the precise sequence of events remains to be determined. Inspector Slack had been making notes with methodical attention of an officer who recognized that his initial assessment had been embarrassingly incomplete. We'll need to question Miss Laura again, this time with proper attention to the discrepancies in her story. The investigation continued throughout the morning, with each discovery adding another piece to the puzzle that was slowly revealing its complete picture. The burned ribbon with its straight-cut ends, the charred rosette fragments with their telltale watermarks, and the gummed strip backing all pointed toward a systematic effort to conceal evidence of tampering. Most damning of all was the condition of the crochet hook that had been found in Miss Laura's possession. Laboratory examination had confirmed the presence of the same gum arabic and almond paste that characterized the official sealing materials applied recently enough to retain its distinctive pearlescent quality when moistened. As the morning progressed and the weight of evidence mounted, Inspector Slack found himself facing the uncomfortable necessity of completely revising his initial conclusions about the death at Ferryman's Lock. What had appeared to be a straightforward accident was revealing itself as something far more sinister, involving careful premeditation and deliberate concealment. Miss Marple watched these developments with the quiet satisfaction of one whose patient observation had been vindicated by official investigation. The truth, as she had long observed, possessed a persistence that eventually overcame even the most careful attempts at concealment. Miss Laura's midnight expedition had provided the final confirmation needed to establish that Cyrus Bellamy's death was no accident. The question that remained was what had driven the nervous stationer to such desperate measures, and what secrets Hamper 14 had contained that were worth the terrible risk of murder beside the ancient waters of Ferryman's Lock. The afternoon sun struggled through the gray clouds as Miss Marple made her way to Dean, Lady Bantry's comfortable residence that had served as the administrative headquarters for the charity fete. The tragic events of the past few days had cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration of community spirit, and Lady Bantry's usually cheerful demeanor showed the strain of recent revelations. Inspector Slack had requested that Hamper 14 be brought to Dean for a final examination before Miss Laura's formal questioning. As Miss Marple often observed, it was frequently the smallest details that revealed the largest truths, and Lady Bantry's expert eye for proper bow tying had proved instrumental in uncovering a crime that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath. The appearance of tragic accident. The village green of St. Mary Mead bore little resemblance to its festive appearance of just 3 days earlier. The bunting had been taken down, the marquees folded away, and only the trampled grass remained as evidence of the charity fete that had ended so tragically. Now a smaller but more solemn gathering had assembled to witness the final resolution of the mystery that had shaken their quiet community. Miss Marple stood beside the trestle table, where hamper 14 had been placed for its ultimate revelation. Around her, the principal figures in the case had gathered at Inspector Slack's request. Lady Bantry with her face grave but determined, Tom Quill clutching his cap with obvious discomfort, Counselor Ashcroft pale and subdued, and the Reverend and Mrs. Clement providing moral support with their quiet presence. Dr. Haddock stood ready to provide professional consultation, while Inspector Slack maintained the official dignity that he felt the occasion demanded. The morning sun cast long shadows across the green, lending a melancholy beauty to the scene where celebration had so recently turned to tragedy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began with the gentle authority that her reputation in village affairs afforded her, "I believe it is time to reveal the complete truth about the events that led to Mr. Bellamy's death at Ferryman's Lock." She approached the hamper with careful deliberation, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of its deceptively innocent appearance. "This basket has been the silent witness to a sequence of events that began with financial desperation and ended with tragic death." Inspector Slack stepped forward with his notebook ready. "Miss Laura has provided a full confession, but we felt the community deserved to understand exactly how the deception was accomplished." Miss Marple nodded graciously. Miss Laura's motive was threefold. First, she had been struggling with personal debts, which led her to borrow small amounts from the committee funds. To replace these advances, she began accepting stolen goods in part exchange at her shop, planning to sell them discreetly to dealers in London. Lady Bantry's expression showed her shock at this revelation. Stolen goods. But how could she hope to transport them without detection? That, my dear Dolly, was where the charity auction's sealed hampers proved so useful. Miss Laura realized that baskets sealed for blind bidding provided perfect concealment for moving contraband. Who would question the contents of a properly sealed charity hamper? Tom Quill shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying she used my baskets for criminal purposes. Indeed, though your craftsmanship inadvertently made her seem possible, your explanation of the split-pin mechanism showed exactly how someone with the proper knowledge and tools could access a hamper's contents without disturbing the lid seal." Miss Marple moved to demonstrate, producing the bone crochet hook that had been found in Miss Laura's possession. With this implement, she could work the split pin free, allowing the side panel to hinge outward just enough for a slender hand to reach inside. Counselor Ashcroft found his voice, though it trembled slightly. But why hamper 14 specifically? Because she had filled it herself with stolen items intended for a dealer in London. But when Mr. Bellamy purchased that particular hamper and announced his professional intention to photograph the unsealing process, Miss Laura faced exposure of her entire operation. Dr. Haddock nodded grimly. So she followed him to the lock to retrieve the contraband before he could discover it. Precisely. She used her knowledge of the basket construction to access the hidden pouch while Mr. Bellamy was arranging his photography. But he turned and caught her in the act. In the confrontation that followed, she struck out, perhaps only intending to push him away, but he stumbled backward and struck his head on the stone coping. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The medical evidence confirms that the blow to his head rendered him unconscious, causing him to drown in the shallow water. Miss Marple's expression carried deep sadness as she continued. What followed was an elaborate attempt to conceal both the theft and the circumstances of death. Miss Laura spent considerable time making the scene appear accidental, resealing the hamper with spare material she had brought for the purpose. She indicated the bow with its telltale characteristics, but her haste and distress betrayed her. The bow was tied left-handed rather than right-handed with straight-cut tails, instead of Dolly's distinctive bias cuts. The rosette was replaced with a duplicate from her book, bearing the hairline crack that the original had lacked. Lady Bantry shook her head in wonder. To think that my bow-tying habits would prove so significant. The smallest details often reveal the largest truths, Miss Marple observed. Miss Laura also had to dispose of evidence. The original rosette, the damaged ribbon, and the gummed strip backing. She burned these items, but fragments survived to tell their story. Tom Quill's professional pride had been wounded by the revelation of how his craftsmanship had been misused. I'll be changing the design of those handles immediately. No more cleverness that can be turned to criminal purposes. Perhaps that would be wise, Miss Marple agreed gently, though the fault lay not in your honest craftsmanship, but in the dishonest use to which it was put. Inspector Slack cleared his throat formally. Miss Laura has been charged with manslaughter and handling stolen goods. The stolen items have been returned to their rightful owners, and a full audit of the committee accounts is being conducted. Councillor Ashcroft winced at this mention of financial irregularities, clearly anticipating uncomfortable questions about his oversight responsibilities. As the gathering began to disperse, Lady Bantry approached Miss Marple with a thoughtful expression. All that elaborate deception, all that careful planning, and it was undone by something as simple as how one ties a bow. Miss Marple smoothed the blue silk ribbon with gentle fingers, her touch carrying the weight of sad understanding. Bows are little confessions, my dear. The hand that ties them always tells its story, whether of honest pride in one's work or of desperate haste in concealing guilt. The morning sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead as the last witnesses to this revelation made their way home, each carrying their own thoughts about how financial desperation could drive even the most respectable citizens to tragic ends. Miss Marple remained behind for a few moments, contemplating the hamper that had held such dark secrets beneath its innocent appearance. In her long experience with the complexities of human nature, she had learned that the most elaborate deceptions often failed because of the smallest oversights. Miss Laura's careful attention to the technical aspects of her crime had been undone by her inattention to the personal details that revealed the human hand behind the deception. As she finally turned to leave the village green, Miss Marple reflected that truth, like the morning sun, possessed a persistence that eventually illuminated even the most carefully constructed shadows. The charity fete would be remembered not for its innovative auction concept, but for the tragedy that had revealed how desperate circumstances could transform even the most ordinary citizens into criminals. The blue silk bow fluttered gently in the morning breeze, its properly tied loops a silent testament to the importance of honest craftsmanship in a world where appearances could so easily deceive.